The American research group Dekleptocracy has identified a narrow but critical niche of sanctions that could deal a significant blow to the Russian military. This niche concerns chemicals needed to produce mechanical lubricants and military tires. The Guardian writes about this. While Western governments focus on big oil corporations, banks, and shipping schemes, it is precisely these low-profile assets that remain the Kremlin's weak point. Dekleptocracy President Christopher Harrison, a former U.S. State Department official specializing in Russia, calls these targets narrow and targeted, emphasizing that they bear little resemblance to the oil sanctions and microelectronics bans that have been making headlines. He argues that these components are difficult to replace and they are what keep military equipment running. Dekleptocracy's latest report states that a shortage of lubricants could seriously impair Russia's war-fighting capabilities. Only a few companies on the global market produce such chemical additives, and almost all of them stopped supplying Russia after the full-scale invasion began. This caused a shortage of motor oils, as confirmed by numerous complaints from the Russian automotive community. However, the Chinese company Xinjiang Richfuel has filled a significant portion of the lost volume and, according to analysts, supplies up to 8 million kilograms of chemical components to Russia annually. Dekleptocracy emphasizes that the blocking of Richfuel and several other small suppliers could trigger a severe lubricant shortage in Russia. Researchers also conclude that Russia has an extremely limited domestic production base for the substances used in the vulcanization of military tires. This means that a disruption to these supplies could affect the entire armored vehicle fleet, from tanks to cargo platforms that transport ammunition to the front lines every day. Experts believe that now is the time for targeted pressure on less visible elements of the Russian economy. The recent U.S. sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil were a significant step, but experts warn that there is no data yet on their effectiveness, primarily due to weak controls over secondary suppliers. A sustainable sanctions regime requires not only identifying vulnerable areas, but also effectively enforcing existing measures. Ukrainian and American think tanks, including Razom We Stand, B4 Ukraine, and C4ADS, are actively researching trade flows to point out the Kremlin's vulnerabilities to governments. According to experts, such initiatives regularly reveal new pressure points, those that have previously remained under political scrutiny. While the world's attention is focused on oil and microelectronics, small chemicals that no one notices could be the lever that can stop Russian tanks. Media previously reported that U.S. oil sanctions are pushing Russia into a corner. Amid U.S. and EU sanctions, Russia is losing control over key processing assets. Serbia and Bulgaria are acting pragmatically. They are not prepared to sacrifice their energy system for Moscow. Analysts say Moscow companies are trying to find a buyer, but the sanctions regime makes such deals nearly impossible. The Balkans are becoming yet another example of how war and confrontation with the West are turning Russian energy assets into toxic and rapidly depreciating assets. Russia's losses will amount to billions of dollars.
The U.S. military has built up an unusually large force in the Caribbean Sea and the waters off the coast of Venezuela since this summer, when the Trump administration first began to shift assets to the region as part of what it calls a campaign against drug trafficking. According to Associated Press, the once-abandoned naval base in La Ceiba, Puerto Rico, came back to life as it became a staging ground for U.S. operations in the Caribbean. U.S. Marine Corps F-35B Lightning II jets and V-22 Osprey aircraft take off and land throughout the day since September as troops move on the tarmac. MQ-9 Reaper Air Force drones, capable of flying long distances and carrying up to 8 laser-guided missiles, have also been spotted operating out of Puerto Rico by commercial satellites, military watchers, and photojournalists around the same time. Recently, the region received a visit from top U.S. military officials to strengthen ties with countries that will serve as staging grounds for U.S. President Donald Trump's Operation Southern Spear. On Wednesday, the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, met with the President of the Dominican Republic, who announced that the U.S. can refuel aircraft, transport equipment, and deploy technical personnel at restricted areas within San Isidro Air Base and Las Americas International Airport. It is the first major public agreement that the U.S. has struck with a Caribbean nation as it seeks friendly allies to support its attacks against alleged drug smuggling boats in the region and beyond. Since the strikes began in early September, at least 83 people have been killed. In previous days, General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and U.S. President Donald Trump's primary military advisor, visited Puerto Rico and Trinidad and Tobago. More than 6,000 U.S. sailors and Marines are operating in the Caribbean in an unusually large military buildup as President Donald Trump targets drug trafficking, which he says is coming from Venezuela.